All right, so we have Godzilla, 1954, directed by Ishiro Honda. Now, this is one of the greatest monster films of all time, and it set off a chain of films of varying degrees of quality. Some of them are good, some of them are just awful. King Kong vs. Godzilla, for example, is one of the worst films ever made. But then the recovery after that, the fourth film that comes after that, Mothra vs. Godzilla, was quite good, I thought. In some respects, even better than the first one. So they waver in quality. But now, the standard commonplace interpretation of Godzilla is that it's a personification of the atomic bomb. Just as the bombs that went off at Hiroshima and Nagasaki pretty much stepped on those cities and flattened them, so too does Godzilla sort of represent this nuclear bomb thing transformed into a mythological image whereby he goes about stomping on cities. That's the standard interpretation. What I want to do is sort of pull that apart and deconstruct it a bit and offer another suggestion. All right, so Godzilla is, of course, a dragon, and so we have to think about the dragon in Asian culture because it's a very different figure from the European dragons. European dragons, their characteristics are that they blow fire out of their mouths, as does Godzilla, which is important. They blow fire out of their mouths, and they guard gold and women. They can't do anything with either, but that's what they embody, like Smaug and Tolkien. These dragons aren't like that. The Chinese dragons and the Japanese dragons come from the Chinese dragons about 700 AD. They're imported, and they pretty much keep the symbolism the same. And so the symbolism is that the dragon in Asia is a personification of the water cycles, the cycle that goes from rain down to river, down to sea, and then back again through clouds to rain. That's what the dragon is. And that's why the dragon kings are always located under the ocean, beneath the ocean. In the journey to the west, the monkey king has to go down to visit the dragon king, and they're always very beneficent and jovial characters. They're not evil monsters, not usually, although sometimes they are. So that's what they represent. But they are also, when you look at the iconography, they are a patchwork of varying different animals. Now, the original myth is that a carp grew into a dragon, and so it has 117 scales from a carp fish. And that 117 is important because 7 plus 1 plus 1 is 9, and 9 is a sacred number to the Chinese because it completes cosmic cycles, so it matters. So the carp elongated as it was struggling to go up a waterfall, and then another tier where it meets some demons that try to obstruct it, and then it overcomes the demons and wants to get to the top, and as it's doing that, its body stretches and elongates it, and it becomes a dragon. So that's the significance of that. And the serpent is, of course, obviously there. So it's a hybrid of a bunch of different monsters. These are eagle's claws, and then here we have the face of a camel, and the ears of a bull, and the horns of a stag. So the whole thing is a patchwork. Now, this is an imperial dragon, and the difference with the imperial dragon is that it has 5 claws. So the 5 claws represent the 5 elements, which in Chinese iconography are earth and water, wood and fire and metal. Those are the 5 elements. And then when you see a dragon with 4 claws, it's not an imperial dragon. So that's the difference. So that's what they are. They're generally regarded as positive characters, not negative characters. There are dragon-slaying myths in both China and Japan, but there are not that many in Japan, far fewer than there are in Chinese mythology. Now, another thing that they do here, and I want to show this, is that another function of the dragon was that it carried the souls of the dead, especially the dead emperor, up to the heavens. And this is a banner from the tomb of Lady Di, and her soul, this is the heavenly world. Up here you can see with the sun, the Chinese have a myth of a black raven that lives inside the sun. And over here you would have the crescent moon. And here is the dragon right here. And riding on its back, let me pull that in a little closer. You can barely make it out. You can see the soul. This dragon over here is not carrying a human soul, but this one is. It's up here. Here is his face right here. So he's being this is the soul of the dead person, presumably Lady Di, although it doesn't look like a woman. And then is carried, and the coils are symbolic of the Ouroboros, the world encircling serpent. So that's the other function that dragons have in Chinese mythology, is carrying the souls of the dead to the other world, especially imperial souls. So now, as I say, there are Chinese dragon slayers such as Erlang Shen, And here he is here, this mighty figure with all of these magical attributes, and he has a kind of modified Poseidon. And there is one myth where, in the guise of Lee Erlang, he's with a group who comes to Guan County, and they hear Grandma Wang crying, and she says that her grandson was to be sacrificed to an evil dragon who was the local river god. So then Lee Erlang jumped out on the dragon and actually did not kill it. So what happens is that he restrains it, he captures it, and secures it to an iron chain, because it's basically a personification of the local river. So it's a myth about getting control over the flooding. And dragons are very often concerned with floods and controlling floods. Slaying them is not necessarily the right thing to do. Although in this charming little story, this is the story of Oki Islands, and it's about this woman named Tokoyo, whose name may or may not be related to the name for Tokyo. Possibly. Tokyo means Eastern Gate, and her name does not mean that. So she comes upon, she has lost her father because her father has upset the emperor, and the emperor, or whatever it is, the local ruler, has exiled him, or put him in prison. So she's separated, but she doesn't know where he's at, and she's wandering around, and then finally she comes to a Buddhist monk who is about to sacrifice a young virgin to a local dragon monster that lives in a cave under the ocean. And she says, "Oh, no, I'll take care of that. I'll take care of the dragon. Step aside, maiden." And she puts a knife into her mouth, and then she dives. Here you can see the little knife in her hand. She dives down, and this is a rare example of a female dragon slayer myth. And then she finds this cave where she's confronted with a dragon here, and a statue of the very same ruler who had put her father in prison. It's made out of wood. So she kills the dragon by stabbing its eyes out, and then she ties both the body of the dragon and the piece of wood to herself, and she swims to the surface, and then eventually she's reunited with her father, because the ruler, whoever he is thankful that she brought his statue back. So that's an example of a Japanese dragon slayer myth. But as I say, as I was doing my research, there aren't that many Japanese dragon slayer myths. Here's one of them. This is the kami god Susanoo, who is basically equivalent to Thor. He's a storm and thunder-hurling god. And this is his fight against Yamata no Orochi, who is an 8-headed dragon. You can see him over here. The heads are kind of hard to make out, but there they are. And he subdues this dragon. So there's that important myth from the Nihongi and the Kojiki. But so here it is. Here is a statue of the creature, a statue of Susanoo and Yamata no Orochi. Here they are, 3 heads instead of 8, because presumably, I'm presuming that the sculptor didn't want to carve out 8 heads. 3 will do. But it forms a nice transition, I think, to Ghidra. So Ghidra essentially is this dragon, Yamata no Orochi, because it's a 3-headed monster. It's my favorite of all the Godzilla monsters that he fights. So there he is, Ghidra. And then, so now I want to bring up this point here, and let's see if I can show this clip. That here's Rodan, which was made right after Godzilla, I think 2 years after it. And so Rodan got its own film, Mothra got its own film, and then slowly they started throwing these guys at Godzilla. And so, but notice this, that Rodan emerges from the earth in this original version. He comes up out of the earth, as does Godzilla in Mothra versus Godzilla, which is the 4th Godzilla movie, and I think one of the best of them. The 2 middle ones between the original Godzilla Raids Again and King Kong versus Godzilla aren't as good, especially King Kong versus Godzilla, which is kind of a descent into parody. But the serious tone is retrieved with this film, with Mothra versus Godzilla, the serious tone of the first 2 films. And it's a very excellent film. I highly recommend it. But the thing about the Earth, these creatures coming up out of the Earth, then, is that they are Gaian creatures. In other words, they are titans who have come up from the underworld, like the giants in Hesiod's Theogony. And so these are Gaian beings that are being sent up to fight against human civilization. Now, another thing, too, that has to be taken into account with them coming up out of the Earth, they evoke the monster that supports the world, that is the world, Ouroboros. Here is a Scandinavian equivalent of Ouroboros, which in Homeric mythology is Okeanos, the world-encircling serpent that bites its tail and binds the world. And here it's the same exact thing in Scandinavian mythology with the Midgard serpent biting his tail. And this is the cosmic tree Yggdrasil, which is the pole star. And these deer are revolving around it like constellations revolving around the pole star. And here's Valhalla, and here's the Earth itself sitting on the back, as it were, of this cosmic beast. And here's another version of it as the world supporting, I think its name is Nidhogg, who gnaws the roots. And there should be an eagle up here. And there's a squirrel named Ratatosk that goes up and down the tree and tells the serpent all the bad things, all the gossip that the eagle is saying about it. And then the squirrel runs up and does the same thing with the eagle and says, well, the serpent said all these naughty things about you. It's kind of funny. All right, and then there's Josh. Okay, and then this is, so in India, the cosmic tree, or actually the root support of the world, is the cosmic tortoise. So it's to be imagined, if you think of the myth of the churning of the Milky Ocean, they use, the gods and the anti-gods use Mount Mandara as a cosmic churning stick, and they wrap the cosmic serpent Vasuki around it, and they do a tug-of-war, back and forth, the gods and the asuras, the devas and the asuras. And as they churn it, it bores into the back of the cosmic tortoise, upon whose back the entirety of creation is being supported. And then when that image migrates over, presumably through China, because we have to remember that in China, writing in the Shang dynasty, a lot of the writing occurs on tortoise shells. And that's an interesting connection with Hermes, and the fact that the lyre of Apollo is made by Hermes from a broken tortoise shell, and Hermes is the god of writing. So by the time this cosmological myth migrates to the New World, it becomes the cosmic crocodile. And here it is, Sepactli, and it's a cosmic crocodile. Its body is the earth, and these are plants coming up out of it, grain and vegetables and so forth. Now, I noticed when I was studying Mayan and Aztec mythology that there are almost no dragon slayer myths in Mayan Aztec mythology. In fact, I can't think of a single one. There's no such thing in the Popol Vuh, the journey about the twin brothers as they're battling the spirits of death and demons of hell and the Xibalba, the underworld. No dragon slaying myths. And I remember thinking, that's odd. The dragon is a personification in Asia of nature, of the natural currents of the water and storms and floods, also hurricanes and typhoons. But so why are there no dragon slayer myths in the Mayan Aztec world? And I remembered, well, that's because that's how you communicate with your ancestors, is with a vision serpent. So here on this Yash Chilan lintel 24, Lady Jacques is down here on her knees, and she is drawing a rope that has thorns in it through her tongue. It looks very, very painful. But the reason for that is if you want to communicate with the dead ancestors, you have to offer them your blood. And so when you offer them your blood, what happens is that a vision serpent will appear. And here's the vision serpent, just one example of it. This is the serpent here. And so it opens its jaws and out pops the dead ancestor like a genie out of a bottle and says to you, okay, what do you need to know? Here, this guy looks rather aggressive, but in other representations, they're not aggressive. So you don't want to kill the vision serpent. You don't want to slay the dragon in Mayan Aztec mythology because it's the direct means of conduit to speaking with dead ancestors. And Mesoamerican culture, very much like Chinese culture, is very heavily ancestor worship oriented, maybe even more so than China, actually. Okay, so back to Godzilla again now. Godzilla then is not an atomic bomb, although it seems like it, but what it is it's the Earth itself, the Gaian mind itself personified as a monster coming up out of the Earth and destroying industrial civilization, the very thing that has created this monstrosity through radiation, a mutation through radiation poisoning or whatever it is. That's what it's meant to be. This is Gaia's response to the atomic bomb. It isn't the bomb itself. Thomas Pynchon has an essay where he calls this Godzilla, he's also talking about King Kong, represent nature's badass. And culture's response to King Kong, nature's badass, was the civilizational badass of atomic technology, to which then nature responds again with its badass, an even bigger one than King Kong, with Godzilla. And that's why initially Godzilla is completely hostile to civilization, to cities, just as Superman was when he began. If you read the early Superman comic books, he's busting up Manhattan. He's a Luddite force busting up Manhattan. And so it takes him quite a while to settle down and become domesticated and become transformed into the immune system of Manhattan, as most of the superheroes are. They represent the immune system, the metaphysical immune system that keeps out astral invasions from the astral plane in the form of monsters. And many of the monsters in Godzilla, they have eventually, over time, he becomes domesticated, and then he starts fighting as the immune system on behalf of Tokyo against these giant monsters like Rodan and Mothra and Ghidra. But at first, he's the problem to be solved. And in the fourth film, Mothra versus Godzilla, they invoke Mothra that has these little twin women who sing songs to it, who basically represent its soul. And Mothra itself is, of course, a symbol of the soul. And because the butterfly and the moth are anciently symbols of the soul, what Gene Gebser calls the soul's death pole, actually. And they convince Mothra to go up against Godzilla. And so there's a huge fight. And the film ends with this beautiful image of the egg that Mothra's egg actually hatches out, come two larvae, and they travel to the island where Godzilla is, and they cocoon him. They completely cocoon him, and he's overthrown and thrown into water. Now, it's interesting if you think about the first film, because that's an example of the Gaian creatures taking care of the Gaian problem here. But in the first film, we learn that Godzilla was created by science, by atomic radiation, and then the character Serizawa, who comes up with the solution at the end of the film, he has a device that separates H2O, it separates the oxygen from the hydrogen, and therefore suffocates anything that's in the water, and it sort of disintegrates his body at the end. He's a kind of displaced dragon slayer there. He's using the sword of science, which cleaves, in this case, hydrogen from oxygen. So it's a technocratic dragon slayer myth in disguise. And in the second film, Godzilla Raids Again, it ends with him being trapped on an island with a bunch of fighter pilots, and it's an ice, like an Antarctic type of situation, and they blow up the island and bury him in the ice. And so he's disposed of in various means and by various ways, but over time they stop putting him to death. Although the series, as it goes on, degenerates into really terrible kitsch, and it ends up in the 1970s being just basically a kid's show. There's a son, Godzilla has a son. He does funny human things, like he does little dances and jumps up and down. It's a total degeneration of what the whole myth was about in the first place. They do reboot it in 1984. There's a reboot, and then there was a string of films there that tried to go back to the sense of the original film and its seriousness. And then, of course, Hollywood now is in process of making films, Godzilla films. There was a 1998 film with Matthew Broderick that was absolutely terrible. And then the new films, there's Kong versus Godzilla, and one that's coming out next year. So the creature has life. It's still alive. People are charmed and fascinated by this particular dragon, which, note, is a kind of hybrid of a European dragon that spews fire and a Chinese dragon that represents the spirit of water or the earth. He comes up in the first film out of the ocean and goes back to it. And in the fourth film, he comes up out of the earth, the Mothra film. That was the clip that I showed with him coming out of the earth. So he's elemental. He's always associated with the elements. But the fire-breathing motif and the emphasis on the dragon slayer motif, on killing the dragon rather than taming it, is more a European thing. And that represents an infection with the Americanization of Japan, I think, getting in there into the Japanese imagination and transforming what had been, in the previous ancient world of Asia, a creature of awe and benevolence and respect, into something rejected, a monster. Because now we're westernized. Now we have industrial technology, building a technocratic dome around the earth, and the earth itself has now become the monster to be slain. And the Japanese, at least at first, seem to be along for the ride there. But I think their attitude changed. All right, so that's all I had to say, and I'll look forward to discussing this with you in class.